Welcome to another study in 1 Samuel. We are today in chapter 27, so we will cover 27 and 28. It's a little difficult. There are some difficulties in this chapter that we'll look at and see how to address. And while I look at these two chapters, one thing that stands out is one that this chapter addresses a point which can be considered as a low point in the life of both David and Saul. It's interesting to see how both of them respond to it. And in the case of David, we know that he has been a fugitive from Saul for a long time. Right? He's been a man on the run. And throughout this period as a fugitive, he's got multiple affirmations of God's plan for his life. Right? He's got his affirmation from Samuel. He's got it from Jonathan. He's got it from the prophet Gad, who actually asked him to go back to Judah, from the priest Abiathar, from Abigail, and even Saul himself has attested to David that he believes David is going to be the next king, right? And God's hand is on his head. Yet David, with all these affirmations, and we know what a warrior of faith he was, right? In his encounter with Goliath, how he put his faith and what he had learned into action. Yet David also has his low moments when he loses his heart and succumbs to the troubles that surround him. Today is one particular such instance, and we see at this moment how he allies himself with the Philistines, who are, we know, the enemies of the Israelites. We know how Jonathan referred to them, right? Jonathan, a man of God, referred to the Philistines as the uncircumcised people. That is, the people who were outside the covenant God had made with Israel. And we know that in this passage today, we will see that under this cloak of friendship, David is still trying to carry out what he sees as the Lord's will for Israel in some very indirect ways, right? So he knows in some way that he is allying with someone he shouldn't, but he is trying to use that in his own wisdom to carry out the Lord's will. Saul, on the other hand, he started well, but almost immediately goes wrong, right, as a king. He also had received multiple affirmations at the beginning of his ministry of God, why God had chosen him. He got affirmations in himself of how God will enable and empower him. But through all of this, we see that there are multiple instances of rebelliousness in Saul, right? And we were told of multiple such repeated instances where Saul was disobedient and rebellious. We know that he lacked courage. In the face of the Philistines, many times he refused to confront the enemy, right? And more than once, Saul's attention was called to the fact that he was not in the Lord's favor, that his failures, that he was a failure before the Lord. Samuel had done it, and many other ways he got, right? He heard it from in an indirect way from David, from his own people, who refused to obey him sometime, from Jonathan, who actually challenged what he was doing. So multiple ways Saul was told that he was going wrong. And Saul, today in this lowest moment, now wants to hear from, we are told in this passage that he was frozen with fear. And at this point, he now wants to hear from Samuel. Because Samuel is the one person he knows of who has a clear message from God always, of God's will. But we see that Saul has now left it too late. Samuel is dead and gone. But yet, the Lord has a message for Saul in today's passage. Okay? Very interestingly, when you take 27 and 28 and compare it with Hebrews 10, 19 to 39, I hope you've read that portion. We just see that how Hebrews has a lesson for us on the superiority of the new covenant, of the role that the Lord plays in our lives, right? And then there is a passage where he gives you a caution, a warning of why, given what we have, the hope we have, why we should not persist in sin, as well as an exhortation to say, please, you must endure. Because the person who has given you this hope is going to come back, right? So today's the passage portion we read, how David behaves and how Saul behaves, are classic examples of the kind of things that the writer in Hebrews is warning us and exhorting us to. Okay, so we'll study the parallels and see how today's portion is an example of what Hebrews is trying to tell us. Okay, so to begin in chapter 27, it's a short passage. Up to chapter 28, verse 2, it would be good if someone can read that portion. Yeah. So, a very interesting portion. We know that this is a path that David has tread before, right? Earlier, I think it was in chapter 24 or 23, David had tried on his own as a single person, fleeing to Achish, right? And trying to take shelter there. But that time he felt very threatened because they all knew about David's reputation. And so he felt so threatened that he tried to act like a madman. And Achish said, what use is this fool to me? So he just kind of ignored David, and David had to left that place, right? Now David's situation is different. At this point in time, so we are here after a very strong passage, a strong affirmation of faith passage in David's life, the encounter with Abigail, and then the encounter with Saul. And immediately we are told about this portion, where suddenly David is seen as a person who's not having much faith because he's trying to flee from Saul and hide with the Philistines, right? And we know, like I said, the Philistines were considered as uncircumcised enemies of God. So clearly we can see David's faith life, right? It's not a straight line upwards, growing in faith always. It has its ups and downs. And this particular chapter is a period where that trend is downwards. So in this portion, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what does this portion tell us about David's decision to ally with the Philistines? Analyze it. Why did he arrive at this conclusion that it's best for me to go and side with the Philistines? Analyze his decisions and try to conclude whether he was right in doing it or whether he was wrong. Okay? So look at what we are told, look at the past, the context that we know of, and see why he arrived at this decision. What was the thinking process? How could he have arrived at this decision? And then what is your deduction? What do you think? Was he right? Was he wrong? That's the first question for us to consider. Anyway, let's get into this portion. So to look at this question, let's just first take a look at what we can summarize about David's situation. We know from 1 Samuel chapter 23 that he had left his father and mother under the protection of the king of Moab. At this point, we are told he has 2 wives to protect and care for. He has 600 men under his care. And we know that they are all going to the Philistine king with their families. So that's a pretty large number of people. We know that Saul's vengeance and anger against anyone, everyone knows about this. Anyone who shelters David, Saul's vengeance and anger will be visited on them. The news of what Saul did to the priests of Nob, because one priest helped David, is probably folklore now in Israel. David also has to deal with the fact that his own brethren, the tribe of Judah, the Ziphites, the people of the city of Keilah, had betrayed him to Saul. So his own brethren are likely to betray him. Now, if you consider this large group of people that David has to lead, he is now far more vulnerable as the number of people who are with him grow. He's easier to track down, more difficult to hide. It's more difficult to move camp. It is much more difficult now to protect all the 600 people, their families, and to provide for them. So this burden that David has to shoulder is increasing. David's men are probably restless. The Israelites in their DNA are people who challenge everybody, right? Even their own authority very often. Even today, that is very true. David's men were probably quite restless with all the wandering, especially when they know that David had at least 2 opportunities to probably end this quickly. There were 2 times David had the opportunity to kill Saul, and both the times he refused to do that, right? And they know that Saul is continuously after them. David knows that Saul is continuously after him. He doesn't seem to be giving up. And Saul doesn't seem to keep his promises. Twice he has promised David. He has promised Jonathan that he will not pursue David. He has promised David directly 2 times. And yet, David has evidence that Saul is not a man of his word. So take a look at David. He's a man burdened with responsibilities, right? He's growing into his kingship. He's going to shoulder bigger responsibilities. But at this point, he's someone who's already a little weary from living on the edge. And he is in despair because Saul is unrelenting. The last time we looked at how important David felt was the promise of the land of inheritance, that he had to be there. He could not be separated from God's promised land, right? But today, was he actually trying to leave the promised land? That's one question we must ask ourselves, right? So here is probably how David reasoned, if you look at the context that we discussed just now. David told himself, Saul is unrelenting in his pursuit. So what can I do? Let me temporarily get out of the areas in Israel where Saul's influence extends. The Philistines are no friends of Saul. So probably if I can be with the Philistines, temporarily, I'll not be there permanently, until Saul, remember last time I forgot the name of the person, the assassin who went with him to the camp, Abishai, right? The man who volunteered, Abishai. So how David had dissuaded Abishai from killing Saul. He told him that I'm willing to wait until Saul is killed in battle or he's swept away by the hand of God, right? So David has not forgotten that. So for a period of time, neither does he want to leave the promised land because he's in the Philistine territory, which is still in Canaan, right? So temporarily he wants to get out of, he wants some relief from from the relentless pursuit of Saul. So he decides, this is one way, let me go and align myself with the Philistines, because here is one place Saul is not going to pursue me, which was good reasoning we see, because we are told that Saul did not pursue him there. Remember, David, I told you, already had one experience with fleeing solo on his own with the king. So this time, David analyzes and says, my situation is different. I can now make myself more useful, at least seem more useful and not a threat to the king, right? There are two things. One is he can seem like a bigger threat to the king, to the Philistine king. So how do you convert the fact that you're a larger group now? I'm a man with commanding 600 people. And how do I make myself useful to Achish? So he comes up with this plan, right? That he will go and talk to Achish, ask for shelter, and he will engage actively in attacking not the Philistines, but people who are common enemies of the Philistines and incidentally common enemies of the Judahites also, of the Israelites, because these are people who stay on the area where Judah is occupying the promised land, the Jeshurites, the Kirizzites, and the Amalekites, right? So David reasons that two birds, one stone. In doing this, I will be cleansing the promised land of the Canaanites. We know that this is one mandate that Saul had, that the Lord had given the Israelites, and every king had that mandate. So he was trying to enact that mandate, act on that mandate. But David is a little devious here, right? He's using to disguise. So I said, no, two birds, one stone. So what he's doing is, while he attacks them, the common enemies, he will disguise it to Achish like he has actually attacked the Israelites themselves who stayed in those regions. And he will leave no survivor so that the actual news doesn't reach the king. And with this, he will get the impression that he is irrevocably breaking his ties with the Israelites. So I'm your man completely. And second, every time he comes back with a booty, he would give a share to King Achish. So we're told every time he came back with the cattle and the clothes and whatever he got from raiding these people, he would visit the King Achish. I'm sure he did visit him empty-handed. So Achish has benefit, and both in terms of possessions, in terms of the booty, as well as he now has a warrior with a reputation who's now going to ally with him against his own people, right? So that's David's reasoning. And that's how he projects himself. And we see that at that level, that reasoning is correct. And that's how it works out for him. So now the question is, in doing this, what was David forgetting? Was he right? What David was forgetting was the affirmations that he received from Samuel. So with all the pressure that he was under, all these affirmations he had received that he would be the king of Israel, that Saul, that God would ensure that he prevails, right? He's forgotten that. We had seen David himself as a man who would receive direct answers from prayers, for his prayers from God. And there were many instances when God directly intervened whenever it looked like David was going to be killed, right? We saw that instance where Saul was chasing him at that rock, where then Saul got the news that the Philistines were attacking, so he left it. That is one point where he could have been captured. We know of the several instances where Saul threw a spear at David. In all of these, so David has forgotten the times when God had directly intervened to save him from Saul, right? David is also forgetting for a period of time the reason for his hope, right? That God would sustain him and never let him go, right? So probably this is a time when his prayer was not effective. Probably it's a time when all the burdens, there was so much of pressure on him, and he decided to rely on his own wisdom, right? So for a period of time, in this period of his fugitive days, David, that man who composed all those beautiful songs, the Psalms, seems to have temporarily lost that tune that was there in him, which allowed him to compose those beautiful songs, right? So with all this weariness from living on the edge, the burden of the new responsibilities that he has to shoulder, and like I think Sarah pointed out, he seemed lonely. He was taking the decision on his own. We don't see him consulting with anybody. So this loneliness of leadership, all of this combines together to overcome the strength of his faith for a period of time. Okay? So verse 1, we see David is reasoning with himself. There is no praying, no consulting with the prophets or with the priest Abiathar who was with him. Second is, he's still trying to stay within the letter of the law by not leaving the land of inheritance and not attacking his own brethren. But the problem is that he is still deviously presenting what he is doing, right? And the third clue is there's a total absence of any reference to God or the Lord in this portion. So from all of this, we can know that David is wrong. What he's doing is wrong, right? So also, there are other evidences in the Bible that tell us in similar situations, what David has done, this running away and trying to go off on his own, do his own thing, is wrong. Elijah had a similar situation in his life when he had this confrontation with all the priests of King Ahab. And when Jezebel and Ahab were after his life, he ran away. He was terrified and he ran away. And for a period of time, he wanted to be alone. And he went and hid in this cave. And when he was hiding in this cave, there was one question God asked him, which is surely a question God would have asked David. Why are you here, Elijah? This is not where I want you to be. You're not supposed to be here hiding in this cave, right? And then this problem that David and Elijah experience is a known risk for anyone whose faith is under sustained pressure. That is why in the New Testament, in Hebrews 10:23, the writer of Hebrews, that's why God inspired him to write and give us some advice in a similar context, right? That's why it says, and let us hold unwaveringly to the hope that we confess. For the one who made the promise is trustworthy. So don't get weary. Hold unwaveringly. That is, don't be weary. Don't give up to the hope. Okay? So also remember, soon after Hebrews 10 is an important portion we are looking at today. It follows with Hebrews 11, which starts off, faith is being sure of what we hope for and being convinced of what we do not see. For by it, the people of old received God's commendation. And in that hall of fame, David is also listed. Okay, so David had lost it for a period of time, but we know that David always was able to come back and look at that period which was bad and actually confess to the Lord, right, and repent for it. So now let's move to the second portion. This is chapter 28, verse 3 to 11. Can someone read that? So in this portion, we see that the Philistines now, and there is a much more firm thrust that the Philistines are doing now. They are in force, they have gathered to confront Saul. And there's a change in their strategy. They have occupied the valley between the hills, right? So Saul is on one side on a hill and the Philistines are in a valley. And incidentally, this witch whom he wants to consult, the medium, the woman in Endor, is on the other side. So Saul looks at them and he sees this large force gathered there. So what is happening is the Philistines are trying to cut Israel into two pieces, right? One is they want to break Saul's back and they want to cut Israel into two pieces, right? So once they defeat Saul, they can first go south and then go north, much like how Joshua had occupied Israel, right? He first went north and then south and then went north, okay? So now Saul is terrified and he wants to inquire of the Lord. But unfortunately now, there's no one. The Lord does not seem to be answering Saul at all, right? So what does he do? He wants to consult someone who can indirectly consult God. And the best person he knows who speaks to God is Samuel, who has always had the word of the Lord. So he wants to now contact Samuel. And there are two time markers here. One is, we are told that it's a period of time after Samuel had died, right? And the second is, we are also told it's a period of time after Saul had eliminated all the mediums and the sorcerers and the diviners and the magicians from Israel. So we're not told that it is at this time that Saul had done it, but at some point in time, one of the mandates that Saul must have had, because that's something that the Lord's laws said, right? That there should be no diviners and mediums and magicians in the promised land. So there's a period of time when Saul was faithful and he had eliminated them. So now there are two time markers. One is it's a period of time and there are at least no known mediums, witches, diviners in Israel. And it's a period of time where Samuel, the one person that Saul wants to consult, is not alive. Saul, we are told, is not able to find answers to the prayers, right? So the question for us in this portion is, look at the methods that Saul finally resorts to when he does not hear from the Lord, right? He is wanting to consult a witch or a medium. But we also know what Saul thinks about them. So why is in this situation Saul having to finally rely on this method to hear God's instruction, right? So again, the question is, look at the methods Saul is resorting to hear from the Lord. Because he has a problem, he does not know what to do, he wants instructions, right? So and why isn't Saul in this situation? What is wrong with the method that Saul has adopted or chosen to adopt? And why is Saul in this situation? That this is the only method for him to hear God's instruction. That's the next question for us to deliberate. Okay, so let's take a look at this part. Okay, this portion I found it a little challenging, also a little difficult, and I'll tell you why. Not this specific. I think it's in the specific part. Okay, so let's take a look at Saul's situation. So, like I said, this time the Philistines are making a very determined push. They want to break Saul and they want to split Israel into two. Saul, understandably, is terrified. We know that's what that's a state that Saul seems to go into when he's challenged by a superior army. Like somebody pointed out, he has already lost David, his most successful commander against the Philistines. And to top that, he has lost the faith and trust of his own son, Jonathan. So the two people who valiantly attacked the Philistines and were victorious are both not people either with him or with whom he has trust, right? Or who trusts him now. In addition to that, we know that Saul has alienated himself from the prophets as well as the priests. We know how the tumultuous relationship he had with Samuel, the word must have spread, right? Because we're told he consulted the prophets, but when I read that portion, he says he inquired of the Lord, but the Lord would not answer him by dreams or Urim or the prophets. So that's not to say there were no prophets. There's a school of prophets that under Samuel's tutelage, but probably they did not respond or they had no message for Saul, right? It might have been influenced by the tumultuous relationship that he had with Samuel. And the priests probably are also not people who want to interact with Saul, right? Because of the massacre of the priests at Nob. Like somebody had pointed out, I think again it was Blessy who said, we know from Samuel 16, verse 14, that this is a period of time where the Spirit of God that once filled and transformed Saul had departed from him on account of his rebelliousness and disobedience. So even that spirit of enabling and empowering spirit of God had departed from him. And with this continuous rebelliousness, disobedience, the lack of the Holy Spirit, Saul finds that God is silent to him and not responsive, right? So the Lord does not answer him, we are told, not by dreams, not by Urim, not by the prophets. So this is Saul's situation. What is the solution? Saul recognizes that in this current situation, that only the Lord can show a way out. That much we must grant him, right? He recognizes this is out of my hands. I don't think it's in anybody's hands, and only the Lord can show a way out of the situation. Now he needs to find a channel to God. All the known channels he tried, no response. God is silent, right? And from his experience, he knows there is one person who God spoke with, and that is Samuel. But remember the time marker? Samuel is dead. He's no longer there. So at some point in time, like we said, the other time marker, Saul had been obedient to God's law. Because Deuteronomy 18:10 said the land must be rid. That is, the Canaan must be rid of mediums, omen readers, and anyone who practiced divination. And looks like there was a period of time when Saul was obedient to the God's law, where he had acted on that command, and he had removed all mediums and magicians from the land. So now, Saul has no way to reach God except the one channel he knows, which is Samuel, and Samuel is nowhere. So the only way he can reach Samuel to reach God is if there is a medium who has escaped the purge, who has not been captured and killed by Saul, right? So that's what he says. That's what he feels is the only solution left to him. Now, what is wrong with this? What is wrong with Saul's solution? One is he was breaking the laws that he knew. God's explicit law as stated in Leviticus 9:31, you must not practice either divination or soothsaying. And 26, that anyone who turns to the spirits of the dead or familiar spirits to commit prostitution by going after them, the Lord said, I will set my face against that person and cut him off from the midst of his people. So he was going against the known established laws of his time, of his people, right? Second, we are asking what is wrong with this, right? So Ephesians, Paul, in the New Testament, Paul speaks to us through Ephesians 6:12, when he says, put on. So the one thing is, I'll just explain why I bought Ephesians 6:12. Paul says, put on the full armor of God so that you can make your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, and against the powers of this world's darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. The times we live in today, there is a tendency for those who are very practical, very scientific, very material, to disbelieve the existence of spirits and devils and demons, right? And C.S. Lewis captures this beautifully in the Screwtape Letters, right? So the Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis has this dialogue between a senior tempter writing to his nephew, who's a junior tempter, about how to tempt people, right? And the senior tempter writes about two equal. C.S. Lewis is writing about two equal and opposite errors into which human beings can fall, man can fall, about devils and spirit. One error on one extreme is to disbelieve in demons and spirits. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. So two extremes. Both of these, the devils, in Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis writes, in both these extremes are equally pleasing because both will lead to error, right? Satan is happy with the materialist, with the unbeliever, because he has a person who does not recognize the spiritual forces that are acting in the world, right? And for the one who's indulging, he's a person who delights in because it's a person he can influence, right? So that's why Paul is warning. Paul is writing, speaking to us today, that watch out. Your struggle is not just against the human forces. It's also against the spiritual forces in the heavenly realms, right? So that's just, I put it there to warn us that, I mean, like, this is not a fairy tale, okay? So both these are reasons. We have a warning from the law in the Old Testament as well as from Ephesians, Paul's letter to the Ephesians, that consulting with mediums and spirits is not a way to find out God's will for your life. Okay? So now let's move to the last portion. So we know Saul has resolved to find a medium through whom, or through the medium through whom he can reach Samuel. So verse 22, 12 to 25. So we see that this woman was initially hesitant, right? Saul's reputation precedes him always. So, but then Saul convinces her that she will not be put to the sword. And so she summons up a spirit. Now, this is a tough part. I do not know what to make of this. Is it a spirit, or is it she faking it? What's happening here? But regardless of what actually happens, one thing we can see, that God uses this opportunity to speak to Saul in a very firm manner, right? So that is one thing that we can see here, right? The second thing is, I just put a note there. I hope you've had a chance to look at that. In Samuel 15, verse 22 to 23, it says that this is where Saul had been rejected as king. There is a small little couplet there that Samuel uses to narrate what will happen to Saul. And we see that coming together, where Samuel predicts that rebellion that Saul has demonstrated and divination are both evil. They are similar. And we see these two similar things coming together here, right, in Saul's life. So the question is, if you look at the entire trajectory of Saul's life, we are coming to the close of Saul's life. This is one of the lowest points, okay? When you look at this entire trajectory, the up and down, how he became king, how initially he was successful, how he turned disobedient, how he continuously rebelled, how he tried to protect his own interests. So when you look at all of this, how would you summarize Saul's failings, right? So also just look at that portion in 15, 22 to 23. So is there something that tells us the summary of Saul's life in this portion? Right. So I guess the question was a little abstract, not very easy to have a pointed answer, but just let's take a shot at it. So God had a mandate for Saul very early, right? There were several mandates that Samuel must have given Saul, right? One is to eliminate the Amalekites. The second was probably to clean up the land of all mediums and spiritualists and all of that, right? So as far as the mandate to eliminate the Amalekites were concerned, he was supposed to eliminate all men and cattle alike because of how the Amalekites had opposed Israel when they were marching towards a promised land. Okay. So Saul, in his own wisdom, only partially obeys that. Right? He attacks the Amalekites, he wipes them out, but he spares the best of the cattle and the king of the Amalekites. And Saul's partial disobedience is very interesting when you look at it. What we're seeing there is Saul exercising his own wisdom. His wisdom to choose between good and evil, between right and wrong. So for me, it was very striking because when you look at the words in Genesis 3:4, when the tempter actually talks to Eve about, did God ask you not to eat from this fruit, right? The words he uses is, surely you will not die. When you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So this is the same thing that Saul is trying to, this one, right? He's trying to separate himself from God's will and he wants to use his own wisdom to choose between right and wrong. And what is Samuel's condemnation of Saul's rebelliousness? He says that for God, obedience is more important than sacrifices and burnt offerings, right? It is better to obey than to sacrifice. And Samuel goes on to tell him, rebellion is like the sin of divination. So interesting that Saul's rebelliousness, his breaking from God, starts with rebelliousness and ends with divination, right? It just folds together like that, right? And Samuel also told him, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, the mandate of the Lord that I conveyed to you, he has rejected you from being king. So the consequence of Saul's continuous rebellion and disobedience is God has turned his back on him. Saul himself announces it when he meets Samuel, right? Or when he thinks he sees Samuel's spirit. He says, God has turned away from me. He does not answer me anymore. And so the consequence we know of Saul's continuous rebellion is God has turned his back on him. And what has Saul got to do now? He only can turn to divination to hear from the Lord. He's in a situation where he knows only Lord holds the answers. And the only way he can do it is through divination, right? And Samuel's condemnation now has come full circle in Saul's life, right? His condemnation of rebelliousness, the two things that he picks on, rebelliousness and divination, both have come together at the beginning and end of Saul's life, or Saul's rebellious life. Now, the difficult part of the question is, what was really happening here? Did the witch of Endor really summon Samuel from the grave? I really don't know. There are a lot of things that I read, a lot of theories, but I rest in the thing that I tell myself, what happened is a mystery. It's not important for me to know exactly what happened there. It is more important to see that the Lord who could take Balaam's curses and turn it into blessings for Israel, the same Lord could use whatever happened in this incident to affirm to Saul the message that Samuel had already passed on. So if the Lord can turn another prophet, a soothsayer, Balaam, the curses he had into blessings, the Lord could actually turn any situation into a method to convey a message to Saul, right? That's what I see from this portion. That's how I look at this portion. Okay. So now when you look at this entire passage, how do we summarize it? How can we summarize it? If you look at Hebrews 10, the first part, 19 to 25, tells you what is our hope. I'm just loosely paraphrasing excerpts from that portion in my own words. Okay. So our hope is the new covenant, which allows us an entry into the presence of God by the blood of the Lord Jesus. We can take assurance that we have had our hearts. In David's time, how could you approach God? Because the tabernacle could be sprinkled, right, with a sacrifice. But the new covenant gives you the assurance that your heart is sprinkled clean from the grip of the evil conscience, right? And we can unwaveringly hold on to this hope. Why? Because the one who made this promise, we are told, is trustworthy. So the presence of God is in your heart, and it's your heart that has been sprinkled clean by the blood of the Lord Jesus. So it has moved from outside, the external altar, to inside. That's the new covenant, right? And then if you have this hope, the writer in Hebrews has an exhortation for you. Because you have this hope, you must endure, right? This hope is strong enough. It's something that is worth shooting for, worth holding on. Therefore, we must endure and persevere against all challenges, because the person who gave you this hope is coming back. He will come back. Okay? So we look at that part, and the portion we studied today, and we can say, in our lives, we should watch out for the kind of stresses that David experienced and succumbed to. The stresses that we are put to because of weariness, loneliness, burden of responsibilities. We should watch out, right? So that's from the David part of it, that's the lesson that I can take out. And what about the other part, verses 26 to 31? There is a warning, right? The warning that with this new covenant, if you deliberately keep on sinning, what you are actually doing is you're rejecting the only acceptable sacrifice for sin that was already done for you, right? So when you keep on sinning, what you're doing is you're rejecting the sacrifice, the only sacrifice that could be done, and that has already been done. Okay, so when we look at Saul, what I can say is we should be cautious. Let's not our life follow the trajectory that Saul's life followed. There is only one way, right? There is only one way to the Lord. And rebellion and disobedience will put your foot on some other way, not on the one way. So that's where I would like to conclude. That's a summary of what we studied today. So the question, I don't know whether we have time to deliberate this. So when you look at this portion, compare it to the Hebrews portion. So something that we can deliberate on is, can you identify with the warning and the exhortation in Hebrews 10, 19 to 25? When we looked at Saul's life, when we dug deep into Saul and David's incidents, how does Hebrews 10, 19 to 25 speak to you in your faith life? Okay, I think we can wind up. Just want to leave you with Hebrews 11:1. Now, faith is being sure of what we hope for, being convinced of what we do not see. This is the preamble before that famous chapter, the Faith Hall of Fame, right, in Hebrews 11. So that in a way, it's a nutshell of what we looked at today, right? One person, two people whose faith failed them. One for a period of time and one in a more definite and in a more drastic manner. Okay. So our next study will be from 1 Samuel chapter 29 and 30. So another 2 Sundays and we'll be done with 1 Samuel.